spy. They were all charged with treason. Now, I knew that the voters here in Pennsylvania would not support me if I took an action, but it was the right thing to do. And so I went to Christiana and I argued for the defense, and in the end, no one was punished. Well, the next time I ran for re-election in the fall of 1853, I lost my seat in the Congress. Some people will tell you that Christiana was the first shots fired in the Civil War. Others will tell you that Harper's Ferry was the first shots of the Civil War. Well, I will tell you this. 3 days after John Brown's execution, I returned to the Congress after 6 years away. My second day back in the Congress, one of my opponents on the other side of the aisle came at me on the floor of the United States Congress with a Bowie knife. Well, after that, it was said that the only congressmen or senators who came to the Capitol and did not have a pistol in their pocket were those who had two. A year later, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States, and South Carolina seceded. Mr. Lincoln and I had a complicated relationship. We both grew up poor. We were both lawyers, state legislators, members of Congress. We both dreamed of a day with no more slavery. And we both recognized that the Constitution protected slavery in the states where it already existed. But once the war came, we split apart from each other. As far as I was concerned, the Constitution might protect slavery in the states where it existed, but it did not protect slavery in independent confederations. On the contrary, slavery gave the South a tactical and strategic advantage on the battlefield. It was our duty under the laws of war to take away that advantage. Mr. Lincoln did not see it that way. So I was more and more outspoken about denouncing Mr. Lincoln. I said in 1862, "Lincoln is nobody." You heard a bit of a speech I gave in 1862 on September 3rd, just a few days, as it happens, before Mr. Lincoln did issue the Emancipation Proclamation. It seems that when he and his cabinet told me, it may come to this, they meant, we've already written it, we're just waiting for some slightly better news from the battlefield so we can release it from a position of strength. In the end, of course, Mr. Lincoln did issue the Emancipation Proclamation, and I am proud to say that I wrote the first draft of what became the 13th Amendment, making emancipation permanent, the law of the land. Now, I told you earlier that the challenge comes when you have to sacrifice what you have for what you believe. Well, I did give up the books from my law library, my seat in the State House, my seat in Congress, almost my life at the point of that knife. And on June 26, 1863, I gave up almost everything I owned. The Confederates came to my ironworks out near Chambersburg and burned the place to the ground, said it belonged to Thaddeus Stevens, who was an enemy of the South. In fact, General Early went further. He said that he had hoped to find me there in person, because if he had, he said, he would have hung me on the spot and divided my bones and sent them to several states as curiosities. Well, no one sacrificed more than President Lincoln did, of course. By the time of his assassination, I was too ill to attend his funeral, too ill to attend any of the viewings of his body. But I did make my way to a railroad bridge near my home in Lancaster. I stood and waited until his funeral train came rumbling along. And I tipped my hat to my good, dear friend, Mr. Lincoln.
Thank you so much, Congressman. You have given us a fascinating history lesson, and I was particularly struck by you having the courage of your convictions and being willing to make sacrifices for those convictions, and yet your biographers have not always been kind to you, have they?
No, not at all. Not at all. Well, for those not familiar, I will say this. If you have a biographer whose key thesis seems to be that everything you ever did was driven by the fact that you were a self-hating cripple, that's bad enough. When that is a biography that is billed as the first one in 50 years to be kind to you, you know you're in trouble. It seems that, I was always a bit controversial, of course. The Democrats got their stories out. Around 1920, I understand, there was a movement in history that said that Reconstruction was the worst thing that ever happened to America, and it was all the work of men like myself who hated the South. Well, historians have, over the years, changed their position, of course. They now seem to believe that Reconstruction was a good thing, despite men like myself who hated the South. It seems not to occur to them to ask, in general, whether I did hate the South. The fact is, I did not. And I should acknowledge that there are some in the last few years who have been much more fair to me. There's a gentleman in Gettysburg, Bradley Hoke, who's written a wonderful biography of my life. Will also give me an inside look at some of my work in the courtroom as well. I believe it's called Thaddeus Stevens in Gettysburg, The Making of an Abolitionist. Wonderful book.
Congressman, we're delighted that some of your contemporaries have joined us for the program. Tell us your name and your comment or question for the Congressman.
I am Marie Tebe of the 114th Pennsylvania Infantry. Good evening, Congressman. And I've noticed that you mentioned a lot about sacrifices made by you, President Lincoln, and many other men during the war. But I wondered if you could say something on behalf of the widows and orphans who were left behind after many of their husbands and brothers were killed during this horrible, horrible catastrophe.
Absolutely, Miss Tebe. Now, I do not want to sound like I'm being self-pitying. That was not my objective. But yes, I do understand. When my brother died, I took in his two orphaned sons. I do understand about orphans. You call her my housekeeper, the manager of my estate, Mrs. Lydia Hamilton Smith, was herself a widow. So I do understand. I believe I understand better than many that when we say 600,000 men dead, that is 600,000 husbands and fathers and brothers and sons, hundreds of thousands of broken families. Which is why, when the war ended, my first battle with President Johnson was, in part, over my proposal to double the pensions that we paid to wounded soldiers and to the survivors of our honored dead. I do believe we owe quite a debt to those men who risked their lives that the country, as Mr. Lincoln said, that the country might live.
Congressman, we have Mary Beatty with us tonight, and as you may know, she was instrumental in helping with the war effort. She formed a group that helped soldiers and others to get through the many tragedies that were part of that war. Mary, welcome. What would you like to share with the Congressman?
Congressman, I'd like to just ask you at this point, but first of all, I'd like to say on behalf of the women, it was in 1862 when we formed the Ladies Union Relief Association, and we did take care of over many soldiers, but there were over 300,000 soldiers that passed through the Harrisburg area at the time of the war and throughout the war. We were very well in tune with how to fundraise and to find donations. And so as we did that, we were able to provide for their care here at home when they came back from the war or before they left. I would just like to know, how was Congress behind the scenes where we weren't aware trying to raise the money to take care of our soldiers?
Thank you, Mrs. Beatty. And thank you very sincerely for all of your work for the wounded soldiers. Now, in Congress, I was the chairman of the Committee of Ways and Means, so it was my responsibility to find ways to pay for the war. We did find some innovations that made it possible. I'll show you one of our innovations. In 1862, the first federal greenbacks in America, the first federal dollar bills. Well, you may be able to see Secretary Chase's picture on his first bill. I tried to tell him it was self-indulgent to put his picture on his own bills. He didn't listen to me. And the very first federal dollar bill in America went to pay a Union soldier. We also innovated in revenue collection. I regret to acknowledge that, yes, indeed, we did introduce the first federal income tax in America. Temporarily, it ended in 1872. If you would like to know how you are still paying income tax, you'll need to talk to a congressman from 1913. Of course, the other challenge was to find contractors who would do the work and not cheat the men. We had quite a battle, especially over coffee. Tried to give the men instant coffee, pre-ground, so they wouldn't have to grind it themselves. until we found that the packets also included dirt from the ground, anything that looked like coffee. That's how we ended up back to giving them the beans to grind themselves. So it was an ongoing struggle to pay for the war.
My name is Sarah Jane Kate, and my question is, I understand that you have been very involved in the practice of law, and I'm very curious to know where and how you received your training in the law.
Now, I said that I taught for 2 years in York. While I was teaching, I was also studying the law. They say sometimes in your time that if someone goes to law school, they are reading the law. Well, I was literally reading the law. That was how it was done in those days. I had made some enemies on the Pennsylvania bar. They refused to allow me to take the exam. I had to go down to Maryland to take the exam. I sat down in a tavern with half a dozen lawyers and judges. They looked across the table at me. They said, "Mr. Stevens, before you may take this exam, there is one prerequisite. You must buy us a round of drinks." I bought them a round of Madeira wine. They asked me some questions, what I had read, what I thought. I said, "There's only one more requirement. One more round." I bought them one more round of Madeira. I came back to Pennsylvania as a newly minted lawyer.
Welcome to the program.
Thanks.
Tell us your name and what you'd like to share with Congressman Stevens.
My name's Jennifer Redman. I live in Lancaster, just a few blocks from the small cemetery where Thaddeus Stevens is buried. And as the congressman I'm sure knows, a little further down the same road is the home of President James Buchanan, Wheatland. So I was wondering what Congressman Stevens' relationship with President Buchanan might have been, and also what he thought of him in general.
Well, I thank you for the question, ma'am. Now, you mentioned where I am buried. It might help you to know that I am not only buried in a quiet, out-of-the-way cemetery, we'll discuss that later, but I am also buried as far away as it is possible to be from Mr. Buchanan, while both still being buried in Lancaster. We disagreed on almost everything. He was a Democrat, I was a Republican. He was a Freemason, I was in the anti-Masonic party at first. We disagreed on almost everything, and yet I did have the opportunity to visit Wheatland not so long ago. I'm looking forward to having the opportunity to invite Mr. Buchanan to come and visit my house when it's done. But I did notice from an archaeological dig there at Wheatland, they had found one old bottle of wine from the 19th century, which, as far as they know, belonged to Mr. Buchanan. You've already understood my connection with Madeira wine. It made me an attorney. Appears to have been one of his tastes as well.
Hi, welcome to the program.
Hello, my name's Wesley Foltz of Caledonia State Park, which was formerly your ironworks. And I believe that you were at Caledonia Ironworks when the Confederates were on their way to the Battle of Gettysburg. And I was wondering how close General Early was to capturing you and sending your bones to the South.
Well, I thank you very kindly, Mr. Foltz, for taking such good care of my old place. No, I'm trying to remember what the exact sequence was. The Confederates had been in Pennsylvania for a number of weeks. They had been occupying Chambersburg for quite some time. Fortunately, word did get to me just in time that I needed to get out of the Caledonia area, away from the ironworks, before General Early came. So if word had not reached me, it would have been a very near thing indeed. Now, I told you earlier, I said that it was a small price to pay if it brought us one step closer to winning the war. I should add this. When I first heard that the ironworks had been burned, my first reaction was to laugh about it. I asked, "Tell me, did he burn the debts as well?" But I cannot give you an exact figure about how close a call it was.
Congressman, we look forward to hearing much more from you, but we're going to take a short break so that we can find out what the Pennsylvania Humanities Council has been doing lately. Not too long ago, PCN's Brian Lockman sat down with PHC's Ann Benzel to talk about the humanities. Here they are.
Ann Benzel, you are currently the chair of the Pennsylvania Humanities Council. What is the Pennsylvania Humanities Council?
The Pennsylvania Humanities Council is a not-for-profit organization whose mission is to promote the humanities and cultural events throughout the state.
What does that word mean, the humanities?
Humanities has many different meanings to different people, but to me, my definition would be the humanities are those elements or entities